This video covers a DCC sound install and full LED lighting upgrade to the Athearn SD70ACe. The steps shown in this video can also be applied to all Athearn locomotives, as most of them are very similar to this one. Materials used for this installation as follows. 1 ESU LokSound Select Direct decoder. You can use any other decoder of your choice if you wish. I used 13 pre-wired warm white LEDs, 7 0603 LEDs, and 6 0402 LEDs. Some 1.5mm fiber optic strands are required, along with 30 gauge wires in various colors, and also 1.0 and 1.5mm shrink tubing. I also used some 2.5mm quick disconnect pins, but this is optional. The quick disconnect pins will make it easier to separate the shell and the chassis at a later date. You need a speaker if you're doing a sound install. For this locomotive, I used an iPhone speaker. You also need adhesives, cyanoacrylic glue, tacky glue, and also liquid tape. For the tools, I used a soldering iron with soldering materials, a pair of tweezers, a pair of pliers and cutters, and also a screwdriver. I will start by taking the locomotive apart. First, I removed the couplers at each end. The coupler screw has a tendency to become stuck in the coupler box as you loosen it. If this happens, use a pair of tweezers to help pull the screw out of the hole. In addition, there are 2 other screws near the trucks of the locomotive. Remove the 2 screws and the shell should come off freely. On Athearn locomotives, there are incandescent light bulbs which run from the shell to the circuit board. So be very careful when removing the shell from the chassis, and don't drop the shell onto the workbench like I did. I recommend removing the right track pickup wires first, and then apply a dab of red paint onto the wires. This is so that you can easily identify the right track pickup wires later when soldering the decoder. If you don't do this and then mix up the right and left wires later on, then you risk shorting out and destroying the decoder by accident. After you have marked the right track pickup wires, you can remove the rest of the wires. There is no need to mark any of the other wires because the left track pickup is already in black color, the motor wires are already marked, and the light bulb wires won't be used. After all of the wiring is removed, you can take out the factory circuit board by gently unclipping it from the motor bracket. I then install the Loksound Select Direct decoder onto the motor bracket and then solder the connections for the motor and front track pickups. You may need to cut the exposed wires short so that it is easier to solder them. Be sure to not mix up the left and right track pickup wires. At this point, I also installed the iPhone speaker by removing one of the weights and then securing the speaker to where that weight was. You can see in the video that I've also fitted a 28mm speaker in the factory speaker housing, but I was not pleased with the round speaker's sound, so I didn't end up using it. After the iPhone speaker is installed, I solder the rear track pickup wires as well. At this point, I also made the chassis side quick disconnect pins. There are 3 sets of quick disconnects. The first set is 2 pins. One has a blue wire for the function common, and the other has a white wire for the front headlight. The second set also has 2 pins, one blue for the function common, and one yellow for the rear headlight. The third set has 5 pins. The middle pin is blue for function common. The 2 pins next to the middle pin are green and violet, which corresponds to auxiliary 1 and auxiliary 2. And the final 2 pins on the edge are pink and turquoise for auxiliary 3 and auxiliary 4. I designed this 5-pin connector so that in the event the connector is plugged in backwards by accident, all of the auxiliary functions will still work. The lights will just be flipped, and there is no risk of damaging the decoder. I then soldered the quick disconnects to the corresponding pads on the decoder. The front headlight quick disconnect goes to the front of the decoder, and the rear headlight quick disconnect goes to the back of the decoder. The auxiliary function quick disconnect goes to the side of the decoder where the auxiliary pads are. Note that I didn't have any pink and turquoise wires for auxiliary 3 and 4, so I ended up using white and yellow wires again. You don't have to follow ESU's recommended colors for wiring, but just make sure that you're able to differentiate each wire and what connection they correspond to. After the chassis side quick disconnects are soldered onto the decoder, I put the chassis onto my locomotive test stand to make sure that the motor and sounds are working. I then work on the shell of the locomotive. I first remove the cab roof of the locomotive, which is attached by magnets, and then use a pair of tweezers to gently pull the factory headlight incandescent bulbs out of the headlight housing. Then I can pull the bulb wires out of the shell. The ditch light bulbs can be removed in a similar fashion. The ditch light bulb must be pulled out of the ditch light housing first, then the wires can be unlatched and removed from the locomotive. Be very careful to not damage the detail parts on the shell in the process of removing the bulbs. I then cut 4 pieces of 1.5mm diameter fiber optic strand to about 5 cm or 2 inches for each piece. And then carefully melt one end of each strand with a heat source, such as a lighter or a stove. This will turn the fiber optic strand into a perfect headlight lens replacement for these Athearn locomotives. I didn't film this step because it was done outdoors to prevent any fire-related mishaps from happening. I then insert the prepared fiber optics into the headlight housing of the locomotive shell, then use tweezers to pull them in place, and finally cut each fiber optic strand to a desirable length, which is about 2.5 cm or 1 inch. I then slide a piece of 1mm shrink tubing over the fiber optic strand so that it prevents the headlight from leaking into the cab. I cut the shrink tubing slightly shorter than the fiber optic strand, and then glue one of the pre-wired 0603 LEDs onto the end of each strand using cyanoacrylic glue, and I finally slide a 1.5mm shrink tubing over the entire headlight assembly so that the light is completely sealed. While waiting for the cyanoacrylic glue to set, I also installed the cab light, which is just one 0603 LED glued to the roof of the cab using tacky glue. The ditch light LEDs are a bit trickier to install. First, pull the ditch light LED through the hole in the pilot to the outside of the shell. Then make a outside 90-degree bend where the LED is, and insert the LED into the ditch light housing. Be sure that the face of the LED is facing forward and visible through the ditch light housing. For the ground lights near the front truck of the locomotive, I drilled a small hole in the shell next to the plastic ground light casting, then inserted a pre-wired 0402 LED through the hole, and then secured it in place with tacky glue. I do this for both sides of the locomotive. For the step lights, I simply soldered 4 pre-wired 0402 LEDs onto the auxiliary 4 and function common pads on the decoder, because the step lights will just be secured to the chassis rather than the shell. I used liquid tape to secure the step light wires to the sides of the chassis. You can also brush some liquid tape to the ends of the step light wires to give them a rubber-like flex so that it is easy to adjust them later if necessary. I make another set of 3 quick disconnects, which are exactly the same as the set that was soldered onto the decoder, but this time the quick disconnects are soldered to the LEDs on the shell. The first one has 2 pins for the front headlight LEDs, the second one has 2 pins for the rear light LEDs, the third one has 5 pins for the auxiliary functions. Auxiliary 1 is the ditch lights, auxiliary 2 is the cab light, auxiliary 3 is for the truck ground lights, and auxiliary 4 is for the step lights, which is left blank because the step lights are already soldered to the decoder. I connect the 3 sets of quick disconnect plugs together, making sure that the orientation of each plug is correct, and then slide the chassis of the locomotive back into the shell. There are a lot of wires involved, so I take my time and make sure not to pinch any wires in the process. I then screw the chassis to the shell and then make adjustments to the step height LED wires so that they line up with the step light castings on the shell. The last step is to install the couplers back onto the locomotive, and the entire project is finished. I programmed this locomotive so that the cab light turns on with function 5, ditch lights turn on with function 6, truck lights turn on with function 12, and step lights turn on with function 13. All of the lighting functions are dimmed to various degrees so that they look more realistic. I will end the video with a demonstration of the locomotive's lighting and sound functions. Thank you for watching.